It's no secret that the physical video game market has been struggling. We've seen games come out with incomplete builds on the disc, publishers completely skipping a disc release, and Nintendo's game keycards for Switch 2, which have no game data on there, all during a time where the market has reached a new low in revenue. But there are still limited print companies that are keeping the spirit of the business alive. And recently, I spoke with the BAFTA member Ryan Brown, who is the former head of marketing and partnerships and communications manager for Super Rare Games, but now also leading Lost & Cult's new game publishing label as marketing director. And they gave some valuable insight into the trials and tribulations of what it's like doing business in this market. Ryan, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on. Genuinely really appreciate it a lot.
So tell me, what does the physical video game business look like in this year, 2025?
Yeah, so I guess that on our end, so there's almost those two types of it, right? So there's the mass market, big mainstream physicals, and then there's sort of what myself is doing and sort of Limited Run, Super and all those other companies, which are a bit more boutique. What's happening is we're obviously seeing a growth of people go towards digital, right? Like that's just the honest truth. There are generations of new gamers who have never comprehended the idea of ownership. They've never owned anything. All their media through music, movies, and games has always just been digital rented, basically. The industry is seeing that physical games is not like necessarily, well, it's not at all growing as a market, of course, like it's only declining. Now, I would obviously posit the people who do collect games and who did grow up with those, people in their 30s, like myself, grew up like that. And they're going to be around for another 50 years, so it's not like the people that are interested and invested in those things are going anywhere anytime soon. Just straight off the bat, the thing that most bigger publishers are struggling with is simply diminishing returns in terms of physical releases. They're dealing with harder and more fussy submission processes and rating processes, etc. In short, it's never really accounted for that limited print sort of boutique model. It still is really catered for retail. Even if you run a limited print type thing, it all is still really made for retail end. The third problem, if we're being honest, is that platform holders, they get more money from digital sales. There's a cost involved in making physical goods. People don't want to be paying too much more for physical releases than they do digitally. And of course, if you buy a £60 game, it might have cost $20 to make that physical release. If you buy a $60 game digitally, it doesn't cost anything. There is no cost. One example I gave at a talk the other day was if you're an indie developer, you can have a physical release of your game that maybe sells 3,000 units. For an indie developer, that can mean $100,000. To maybe Microsoft, that is sort of not worth doing, but to a small developer, that is life-changing amount of money. And I think so long as there's always going to be an audience, which I think there will be for the next 40, 50 years, I think there's always going to be some answer to physical games.
So let's get into the studio and publisher relations. Who's reaching out to who first? How often does that happen? Does anybody need convincing? What does that really look like to get the ball rolling?
Oh, yeah, sure. So for us, because obviously we hadn't announced publicly, we exclusively had to reach out to others. You don't necessarily need to convince indie devs sometimes, but for sort of AA or higher, you do definitely need to convince some of the benefits of why to do something like this. But generally speaking, obviously I was at Super Rare Games at my last job, and I'd say there and for most physical games publishers, it's a mix. It's 50% you going to developers and trying to sell them on the idea. It's 50% developers coming to you going, I grew up with Nintendo games, physical releases of Nintendo games. I want to see my game on a physical box. I honestly think that the majority of partners that physical publishers work with nowadays, the reason that those games happen is because not for monetary reasons. They just want to hold their own game in their hands. So yeah, it's a mix. 50% we reach out to devs, 50% they come to us. We've only launched a few days ago, but already I'm developers and publishers in my inbox and emails going, oh, let's chat. So I'm sure it will end up being a mix going forward.
So I think one thing a lot of people really want to know more about is what's going on with these incomplete builds. Why are publishers doing this? What's really going on with that?
Yeah, so I think it's multifaceted, as all things are. I mean, first and foremost, people simply do not comprehend how close to the wire games get finished across the whole of the games industry. It is often days before launch where things are still happening. Sometimes even the launch day or the day before launch. They're big projects. They are really struggling to meet those deadlines. Everything comes very close to the wire. And increasingly so, especially for big publishers, they are really becoming dependent on this idea of not being beholden to retail anymore. So it's like, we can launch on this date, but then we'll just have a day one patch, or we'll have a patch come out in the week after. They're very reliant on that. I know it seems silly that what could 7 days save, but it does. Like 7 days of development is huge. So it's certainly not ill-intended. It's just that they come close to the wire. Another aspect is, as I said before, really, unfortunately, physical releases are becoming a lot less vital to larger publishers. If you're looking at 13 million digital sales and they sell 100,000 units physically or something like that, that latter part becomes almost inconsequential. Now, I personally do think that these platform holders and publishers that do this are really under appreciating what a big deal this sort of stuff is. But I wouldn't be shocked if the game key cards for the Switch 2 were really not very good sales-wise. They probably will be for the launch, just because when people buy a console, they'll just buy everything. But I think what's really going to become important to see is the months afterwards. So come December, at the end of the year, come January, February, like what are those game key card sales looking like? I think we've already announced publicly that Lost and Cult is going to be doing Switch 2 releases, right? Obviously, we ain't touching game key cards for very obvious reasons of preservation and making sure that you don't just have an empty disc, etc. Already I'm having to try and explain to developers why that is so important, and some partners just don't really understand. And again, not through malice, but they just haven't thought about these topics that matter a lot to you and I and a lot of people listening. The larger the publisher, the larger the game, the more that applies. The smaller the developer, smaller the indie, they're a lot more principled, I suppose.
Do you think it's possible to start having a dialogue where you approach publishers and say, hey, let's get your game on a disc, or in some cases, let's do a reprint because your first one was incomplete? Is that possible?
Yes, 100%. So I think for us, when we release a game, we are almost certainly never going to release the physical version day one of any launch, be it an indie or an AAA anyway, because there's always patches, there's always bits that need fixing. I want that stuff on the disc and cartridge. I think other collectors are always going to be willing to wait at least some months in order to receive a physical version, to make sure that it's a permanent physical version that will always work off your shelf for the decades to come. And basically, I want to be going to AA partners, AAA partners, etc., and sort of convince them of those topics. And generally speaking, we're trying to sign titles that haven't had a physical release before, because I think that's probably more appealing to PlayStation gamers and Nintendo gamers and collectors. But I think there is an appetite for us to go to AAA partners, etc., and release a complete edition with all the content and say this is the final version of the game and it's going to work forever. Yeah, I hope that we are the first step towards that. I also hope that lots of people copy us. I have no problem with other physical publishers or other companies coming in and just ripping us off and doing the same thing. Go and work with Does It Play and make sure that those discs are fully preserved.
Let's talk about something you can't easily talk about, and that's margins. When you release a physical game, there is a cost. So what's that model look like nowadays?
I guess this goes into why those big AAA publishers are trying to get away from it, because unfortunately, I can't talk about the actual literal costs, and I wish I could. I actually love being transparent. I think it's really interesting, but it's not my rules or Lost in Cult's rules. We're just not allowed to do it, right? But as you can imagine, there are costs involved in making a physical version of a game. For example, we're selling our standard edition copies of games at $34.99, right? I would say that in order to make that happen, the margin that a developer will make is probably still less off of a physical release than they would off of a digital game, even if the digital game is sold cheaper, because there's no cost. I mean, there's a very small fee that the platform holders will take, but other than that, it's just pure profit. There's no cost in making a digital version of a game. So that's why we're seeing those big partners trying to wean themselves and their audiences off of physical stuff. For indies, it can vary, to be honest. I mean, what's really interesting, especially on this more boutique, like limited print, limited copy thing, is I've worked with some indie developers where they've actually made more money off of the physical release of the game than the digital version. That doesn't happen all the time, but I think there's some games that just fit a physical version so much, and I think you'll feel like what kind of games maybe work really well as having a physical release of. Even if people have never heard of it before, they'll go ooh and pick it up on a disc. I think if a multi-billion-dollar company can do something that's right and good, like making a physical release that will last throughout time. And they also still make not millions of dollars, but they make some good money off of it. Why would you not do it? Why wouldn't you?
See, you're not wrong. So, for limited print companies, I'm sure you know a lot of people don't like this, but it's that model of pay now, get the game later. In some cases, a lot later, 6 months to a year. Can you elaborate on that process?
So it's typically like that to de-risk. So it's because of the minimum print numbers that are required for PlayStation games, which are actually slightly less risky, by the way. And Nintendo Switch games. There's risk because there's minimum prints. There's certain numbers you have to be able to meet. So some companies, their model is, well, let's launch it, see how many units it is, and then we'll go to print. And when I say go to print, there's the age rating submissions. There's the submissions of the games to platform holders. When you're publishing a physical game, it's like you're publishing a game. I mean, it doesn't matter if the game has already existed digitally, you still have to go through all those hoops. I think for a lot of people, it's de-risking. It's just knowing exactly what the demand is going to be upfront. And that's a totally legitimate, 100% understand why companies do that. I think annoyingly, in the modern age, it's just something that we have to live with in order to actually own our things. Personally, for Lost in Cult, obviously we're trying to get around that a little bit. Because we have that retail end, we kind of are pretty certain that every game we're going to launch is going to hit those minimum prints just through the retail standard edition. So we're working ahead of ourselves. Like, we've already signed 15 plus titles. We're already working on the next one and the one after that and the one after that and the one after that. So we're trying to get ahead of ourselves so that we can slowly slim down that shipping window. We've told people 6 months for these first releases, but that's just because I want to build in some leeway. In actuality, we're hoping it will ship within 3 months. By the end of the year, maybe they'll ship in 1 month or 2 months, and maybe in a year or two, we'll have them at the point that we launch them.
Well, that's good, but you do raise a good point. It's that minimum order quantity, which you can't say.
Yeah. And again, just so people are aware, it's not me or Lost in Cult that is banning ourselves from talking about that. We're literally not allowed to say what they are, but that information's out there. You can find out what those minimum prints are fairly easily if you want. Typically, look at how many units companies are doing. You'll kind of work it out. Those unit limits, I can't say what the numbers are, but they're not extraordinary. They're not like you have to make 100,000 units. They are achievable.
And there are still those other issues of replicating AAA or Blu-rays, the submission process, actually getting into a retail presence.
Yeah, skirting around what I'm allowed to say, I think the best way for me to explain it basically is all of those processes exist, and they treat it as if a physical game is a separate release, as if you're releasing a video game for the first time. If it's already come out digitally, doesn't matter. You're basically releasing a video game again. So all of those steps you think you may have to go through in order to release a game digitally, like QA, like age rating submissions, platform holder submissions and approvals and testing and all of those things has to happen again for a physical game release. Much of those processes were built, of course, for retail. They haven't really, still even now, accounted for boutique publishers and for companies that are selling their games exclusively online. The processes haven't really modernized themselves for that, and in some cases have got even more difficult than they were 10 years ago.
So Nintendo Switch 2 game key cards. I'm sure we're all wondering the same thing, so in the most NDA compliant way, what's going on there?
The most NDA compliant answer I can give is that genuinely much of the games industry is in the same boat as everyone watching, which is we don't know what on earth is going on. so much of the questions everyone is asking about that are the exact same questions we're all asking as well. You know, what I can say is Nintendo Switch had the largest physical games sales percentage of any platform. In some cases, up to or exceeding 50% of sales of a game, certainly for the case of their first-party games. So I think it shocked everyone that the Switch 2 has come along and it's almost like the least physical appropriate company. It is my opinion, and again, I'm still finding out. I have no idea about a lot of this stuff, but it is my opinion on if it turns out that it costs more for that to happen. I think collectors would still rather pay an extra $10 or what have you in order to make sure that they have a proper version of that game.
So let's talk about Lost in Cult's publishing label. I love what you guys are doing, where it's the editions version, that's the sort of high end boutique one, still having that retail option as well, working with Does It Play. It sounds like it's a passion project.
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah, 100% the passion project. It has been, all of these things are topics that have been deeply important to me personally for many years. As a gamer, as a collector, I wish I had it here, but back at my mum's house where my old room is, I have literally thousands of physical games. I have lots of glass cabinets of merchandise and lovely nonsense. I love physical stuff, and that applies to John Doyle, who started up and runs Lost in Cult as well. Again, like releasing physical versions of games and doing it properly is deeply important to us. You know, I want other people to copy the way that we're doing it. For example, our partnership that we have with Does It Play, where they are testing each of our game builds before they go to print to make sure that every game works without the internet connection, to make sure that all the latest patches and updates are on that car or disc. I want people to work with them. Please copy us. Please go and work with them, guys, and have them approve your physical releases. Yeah, it's a total passion project. We want to make this prestigious, gorgeous version that gets a lot of prestige and is treating video games as a serious form of art, because that's what Lost in Cult is all about. But then also, we don't want to just lock it away behind a restricted number of units. We release those games at retail at the same time. The discs are the same, it's just the extra goodies. We try to address pretty much every point that I myself as a collector and I've seen other collectors make. Hopefully other people like it at least a smidge as much as we do. And then we're good.
And I really like what you're doing with the higher cost edition versions, where it's like less keychains and figures and things like that. It's a lot more boutique with like the developer commentary, the original art, and things like that.
Yeah, I think, again, we just wanted to do something different. So partially it's to do with Lost in Cult. Like, what we make already is really gorgeous, design focused, prestigious art books, diving into sort of the stories of how video games are made, etc. And we wanted to give that treatment to our video games. For us, it's just like we want to be able to, that's our way to celebrate a game in the biggest way possible. Like, it's a sheer love letter, a sheer celebration of a game and its history and its impact. All original artwork across all of those pieces. We were talking to Andrew Borman at the Strong Museum in New York, and I was trying to get his opinion on physical games and limited games and stuff. And he made a really good point about how, you know, a lot of limited print companies are saying preservation when sometimes they might mean availability. And that was right. And it was like, actually, we want to apply preservation not just to having the game on a disc or cartridge where all the content is on there, but preserving the story behind the game itself. And that's what that booklet is. We interview the developer, we have them tell the story of the game. We want to tell a story of the journey of that game. And then we get in development or concept art or character models and stuff from each of the developers and lay that out throughout the booklet as well.
Ryan, thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you ever so much. Genuinely really appreciate it.